Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, a client call is usually a request for help. The problem lies with the client's timing on when they ask for help. All too often, it ends up being more like a cry for help. They do not ask for help early enough.
Michael, I totally agree with that. And, before we bring in today's guest to help us actually close out Season 4, and now can you believe it? Season 4 is almost over. I want to ask you an important question. Have you ever hit a piñata?
Well, I'm from Texas, so of course, and I have been the person in charge of moving the piñata when my oldest son, who is now 24, was 4. He accidentally, when he was blindfolded, thought I was the piñata. And he has 4 younger siblings to prove that it wasn't permanent damage, but it could have been.
Fair enough. And so, for those who aren't familiar with piñatas, that is the paper mache animal typically that's hanging from a tree with a rope or from a fence or from a playground, and people hit it with a bat and hopefully candy falls out of it. And so we had some good friends, or still good friends of ours, and the father grew up in Mexico, and he claims that you can't have a party unless you have a piñata full of candy and you crush it with a baseball bat.
You had to use the word crush.
Yes, absolutely. And so every single time we go to his house for a birthday party, Christmas party, New Year's Eve that they host, they always have a piñata. And as kind of almost like your story goes, it's kind of funny when the kids were smaller, you'd blindfold them, spin them around, give them a baseball bat, and you'd see them kind of swing and miss constantly. But now that the kids are all older, my youngest being 13, it's kind of terrifying because you're looking at, someone with a major league swing. And the fact that no one, at least in these parties, have been hit by a baseball bat still is a minor miracle.
Okay, so what does all this have to do with our guest today?
Right. So being blindfolded and swinging at an object, hoping that you connect, is not a great strategy to succeed in life. And all too often, we do get these phone calls where the clients blindly enter into an arrangement, never looking into the actual details. And all of a sudden they find themselves in this big mess. And yeah, sometimes they can connect and actually hit the deal or the piñata, but way too often they miss and cause a much bigger issue. And so today's guest has a story about the trials and tribulation of his first employment agreement. And so whatever reason, I thought of the piñata story.
All right. Well, how about we transition into something a little more formal, and let me formally introduce Gary Tuma, MD, is a plastic surgeon. Many of our audience will know him. He is a rock star in our industry and a speaker. He is from the Philadelphia, New Jersey region, went to Boston College undergrad, Jefferson Medical College for medical school. He's double board certified in general surgery and plastic surgery. He's a founder of Plastic Surgery Associates of New Jersey. As I mentioned, he's authored several medical reviews and book chapters, and has been a presenter for years with both you, Brad, and our partner Alex Tiersch at the ASAP's Resident Symposium. When he's not working, he is following one of his personal interests, which include skiing, lacrosse, golfing, dining out, I'm guessing pre-COVID, gardening, and reading. Welcome.
Well, Gary, as you know, we actually have known you about a half a dozen years now, and really have enjoyed spending the time with you at these different trade shows, or more importantly, when we spent actually a lot of time with you at the Resident Symposium that Michael just referenced. And, you've shared a lot with that audience over the years, so we were super excited to have you join us. But before we kind of jump into all your story, can you kind of give the audience, why did you decide to become a medical doctor?
So I flew up from Emory, Atlanta to Philadelphia to join my future partners to sit down and go over the contract and what it meant to join the practice. And, like these meetings often take place at a very nice restaurant. I was super excited, and we had some nice food and some drink, and I was super pumped about the opportunity. And all 3 partners were there telling me how great it was going to be and how successful I was going to be. And this was the best thing I ever did. And so I got a little bit blinded and a little bit maybe some red flags I didn't really appreciate while sitting there or looking back, certainly. And the best part about that whole thing was when they finally handed me the contract, which was at that meal, at that dinner, at that meeting. I'll never forget it. And it's really funny because we were cleaning out some old files actually last week, Brad and Mike. It's crazy. And I found that contract, that original contract. And on it, the senior partner had handwritten. And as he's handing it to me, he basically read to me what he hand wrote over the typed contract from the lawyer, which essentially said, "Welcome to the practice. We're super excited about you being a part of this. Here's the contract. You can do anything you want with it. You can show it to a lawyer or not. You can show it to your parents or not. Doesn't matter. But there won't be a period added or a comma changed.
Wow.
Either sign it or don't." So I probably should have known at that point that this was going to be a challenge. But I truly was overwhelmed by this opportunity. And I did show it to a lawyer. Actually, it was a friend of mine. I should have been way smarter about that and showed it to someone to the likes of you guys. But I signed it and went down that path. And
so, Gary, were there any negotiations at all?
No.
So it was sign or here it is or nothing.
That's exactly how it was. And it's actually handwritten. I have the contract. It's handwritten on the front page.
That's
just like that.
Does it still smell like a cigar by chance?
Yes. Yeah. I still have that taste in my mouth. It brings me right back to that moment.
It's so crazy, Gary, because I, as you told the story, we have a lot of clients that are kind of my dad's generation. So we, many years ago, probably around the time you signed this, we had those clients who would get offended if someone asked for changes on an employment agreement. But I've never had them actually write it, a note on there saying nothing will be changed.
Yeah, handwritten. I mean, it wasn't inflammatory. It wasn't to be aggressive or mean. It was essentially, this is the contract. This is the opportunity. You either be a part of this or not. That's it. And, look, I think you're right. I think there is a generational aspect to that kind of a negotiation and that hiring. I mean, one of the challenges that we have in medicine, which I don't think is currently true, is that, we just kind of accept what our senior mentors tell us. And we just we're good soldiers. We just do what people tell, because that's our training, right? We just take care of what needs to be taken care of. People tell us how to do it or where to do it, and we just show up and do it. And so that kind of mentality, especially during that time. So that was in 2005 is when I signed that contract. That's after doing 9 years of residency. Wow. So I was ready for a job. Yeah. My wife was ready for a job.
Your bank account was ready for you to have a job.
Everything was ready for a job.
So talk about, how long were you an associate, and then did you end up becoming an owner of the practice after you had signed this contract or a few years later?
Yeah, so some interesting things about it. So when I signed the contract, I was very excited. When I came home and showed my wife the contract and the handwritten note and told her a story, she was an investment banker, so she thought I was insane and was like, this is a problem, and she knew way ahead of what I knew about where this was headed. But it was reasonable. I mean, they paid me well, not great, but well, certainly a lot more than I'd ever been paid before. And so I think that contract, I think I was paid $135,000 or $140,000 a year guaranteed, and then a bonus. So this is 2005. At that point as a fellow, I was making about $40,000 a year. As a general surgery resident, I think I started at $23,000. So just to give everybody an idea of the finances back then. And my senior partner, once I signed it, he told me, I think I got maybe 3 to 4 years in me. So when I left 7 years later, and then really up to almost, I think 14 years later, he was still working. So those kind of conversations, I think, are also, important for your listeners to understand that, you can't really predict the future.
Yeah.
Until somebody has it in writing. That it's just lip service. But anyway, when I joined the practice, it was great. I was doing everything I thought I'd be doing. I was doing big cases. I was in an academic center. I always thought I'd only be at an academic center. My second red flag, aside from that, was when, I would ask, to be able to sit down to see how I was doing, how my practice was growing. I mean, I knew what I was doing from a workload perspective, but I had no financial insight. They didn't share any of that data with me. And so I'll never forget the first time I went to my senior partner, which I was about 6 months in or 8 months in. And I said, I'd really like to see how I'm doing and see where I'm going. And, can I get any feedback for coding and billing and these kind of things? And he said, sure. And he literally whipped out a napkin and he wrote down a number. And he said, that's what you did last month. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, that's what you did last month. And then he wrote another number down and he said, but that's what you did the month before. And he wrote another number down and he said, that's what I did, that, and so on and so forth. So I was like, okay. I didn't even know how to respond. And so fast forward to my first year, which is then once again, when we're going to talk about potentially any kind of bonus compensation. And I had been very busy. I mean, I was doing free flaps and I was doing big cases and not so much cosmetic surgery at that point, but I mean, I was doing everything. Mm-hmm. And, so once again, I thought we'd sit down, we'd review my numbers. There may be a spreadsheet would have been nice, something that looked more formal, but
besides the napkin, that's not,
yeah,
was it a nice,
another napkin?
Another napkin. It could have been a nice cocktail napkin, maybe.
No, it was literally just like a lunch napkin. And he wrote a couple numbers down. He's like, yeah, I'm sorry, you didn't get your bonus. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that went on for a couple of years. And then eventually the plan per the first contract was after 3 years to have a path towards partnership. And, to answer your question, an opportunity to become really vested in the practice. And so then those conversations began and they were very similar. And not why I thought they would be any different, I'm not sure, but they were very similar to the other ones, which was, here's the plan. Here's what you in order for you to become part of this practice, you have to do, and this is it, and either take it or leave it, which essentially was the practice they thought was worth $1.5 million a year. And over the next 5 years, I could pay in for $300,000 a year for 5 years for $1.5 million. And if I didn't make the payment, they would only charge me 8% on the remaining number. And then I said, okay, that's fair. That's what you think the practice is worth. But, I'd like to see the financials. And they said, well, you can't see the financials until you're a partner. And I said, well, how do I know what I'm buying? And they said, you got to trust us. And I said, well, I appreciate that you think you're trustworthy, but there's just no way I'm going to buy something that I don't know what it's worth. And you're telling me it's worth this number, but I have no idea what it's worth. They didn't own anything. They didn't have any hard asset. They leased their space. We didn't have a surgery center. There's really nothing. I was doing all the sweat equity in the practice. I was doing most of the call and taking care of all the patients and doing my part. They had some old computers. We had a huge amount of space that we were renting, almost 14,000 square feet in Center City, Philadelphia.
Wow.
Was a number. So I was like, that's just not going to work for me. I can't buy something. I said, I'll sign an NDA. I'll be happy to look at this and then let you know. And they go, well, no, this is the deal. Like, you either be a part of this or not. And so then I knew it was not going to work. Mm-hmm. So then I started to look for opportunities, and I got super lucky that an opportunity came up, and then I ended up settling where I am now. And then when it got really bad, and I like sharing this story, I'll never forget, not the senior partner, but the next one down, actually the one just above me. And he was the one who kind of brought me along. We were in his office late, and he said, Gary, he goes, this is getting a little tenuous, and you should be more respectful and appreciative of what we've done for you. And I said, well, I am all those things. And I said, but I can't do something that I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not paying you money for something I don't know what I'm getting. And he said, you know what? He's like, I can throw a rock and replace you. And then I stood up from the desk and I leaned over and I said to him straight in his face, and I'll never forget it to the day I die. I said, well, then you better warm up your arm. And then I walked out, because then I knew it was just not going to work any longer. And that's as factual as it gets. It's exactly how it played out. And it's a shame, because I really did love that practice, and I probably would have never left that practice. But our vision of what I should tolerate was very different. And so that's kind of my story.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. And I've heard so many variants, especially for kind of your generation of plastic surgeon that have gone through similar stories. But that one is, there's something about being at one of those really strongly branded, almost famous practices, and just that, kind of, you use the analogy to the firm, and we've seen that, and it's crazy. And it's been amazing to see through stories like this how you start to see that this is not an accepted way as much anymore for practices to recruit partners. But there's still so many pearls of wisdom to get from that.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't mean to I was there almost 7 years, and on a day-to-day basis, it was fantastic, and I learned tremendous amount from them. And in many ways, they treated me like their son and their partner, but it just came down to the contractual negotiating and what the expectation was for the financials. And truth be told, I'm of the generation where, I don't know how many people behind me would be willing to do. Like, at some point it stops. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to be the last one holding the bag, and not be able to turn and be able to do that. And truthfully, I don't know that my personality would allow me to do that to someone else. Yeah. And so I just knew that it wasn't going to work. And then I got lucky that I had an opportunity that enabled me to make a decision that turned out to be the best thing I ever did. Awesome.
Well, so Gary, our theme this season for Legal 1-2-3s with ByrdAdatto is, when should I ask for help? You may have heard us mention that at the beginning. What advice do you have for our audience from the lessons learned from your story, and on when they should ask for help?
Yeah, right away. So I've had the pleasure of meeting you guys and talking to you guys and having you guys out at the symposium. It's a little shameless plug for that, but I think that we don't do enough in our society to educate young doctors about the next steps. We're so good at training doctors to become doctors, but we don't take the time and effort to expose them to the challenges that some of these people will be small business owners, and some of these people will be employees, and what that means, and how that's all going to, they just think they're going to go and make a nice living, which most of us do. And, but they don't think about those other things because they're not exposed to it. And so things that you guys are doing with this podcast and the symposium that we do, to really introduce them at an early stage in their career, I think is hugely beneficial. And so asking help early, asking your mentors, talking to people outside of medicine, business owners, practice managers, lawyers, investment people, insurance people, all those people will give you knowledge that you can then use to help try to protect yourself and then try to set yourself up for success. And so I don't think it's too early to ask for help ever, really. I mean, that's true probably in anything.
That's awesome. Well, Gary, we are, again, super grateful that you chose to spend some time with us today. I know our audience is going to love this episode, but we're going to say goodbye. We're going to go to commercial. And on the other side of this, Michael and I are actually going to kind of break down some of our legal thoughts on this. But again, thanks again for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure, guys. And it's always a pleasure to see you. And hopefully we'll share a cigar and a drink someday.
Love it.
Awesome. See you.
All right.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise, Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season the theme is, when should I ask for help? So for the second half of the show, we are joined by our friend and colleague, Bala Muhan, to help us break down today's story. Michael, please introduce Bala.
Bala is our colleague from India. She's married to her husband, Raja, has a daughter, Mira, and a child on the way. I don't know the name yet. I don't know if it's been revealed, but we will look forward to knowing that. Bala's in our Dallas office. She went to school at Anna University in India, then has a master's in entrepreneurial biotechnology from Case Western Reserve University and law school at University of Maryland, and just a treasured part of our firm. Welcome, Bala.
Michael and Brad, it's my pleasure to be here. So I'm excited, and thank you for having me.
Well, Bala, most people, when they're reviewing their employment agreements, they only really examine the compensation. That's a section they just kind of stare at, because that's the thing, like, hey, how much money is going to my bank account? That's all I care about. But, we like to look at it from other factors. So what are some of the things that a medical provider should review?
Yeah, that is so true. While I can understand why, compensation is a very important piece to any employment agreement or arrangement, as you said, there definitely are some other key business terms and conditions you want to review and understand. And at a high level, one being protective covenants, such as non-competes and non-solicitation clauses. Specifically, what are the restrictions as it relates to providing your professional services once you do leave the practice? Second, I would say, would be the termination language. You definitely want to understand how you can get out of the contract. So here I want to highlight three important pieces that are generally tied to compensation and that are generally tied to termination that you want to understand. One being notice. What is the required notice of termination? Typically somewhere between 30 to 90 days is generally considered standard. So if you see something like 120 days or 180 days or 6 months, you definitely want to pause and think about it if that'll work for you. Especially because once you've given your notice of termination, it's an awkward time for both parties. Second important piece tied to termination language that you want to understand is what happens to the compensation. Specifically, incentive compensation, will that be paid in full? Will you forfeit a certain amount once the contract terminates? And you also want to understand when that will be paid, especially important when you have accounts receivables that is yet to come to you. And the third piece, typically tied with termination, would be you want to think about and understand what the malpractice insurance language says, specifically in relation to tail insurance and who will be responsible for its expenses. I also want to say next, in addition to protective covenants and termination, I want to highlight that you want to have your contract in writing. Definitely have a written contract because this, in essence, will help you and the practice ensure your expectations out of your contractual relationship are basically in alignment, or in other words, having the expectations in writing will assist in mitigating unmet expectations. So the takeaway here is you want to detail out your expectations in writing in the contract. And finally, the fifth important piece I'd say is patience. The ultimate question here is, to any medical provider, is basically going to be, how are you going to be busy at that practice? You want to understand how you'll get your cases, what type of cases can you or will you be working on? And in general, at a high level, what are your on-call coverage expectations? These are just some of a few things that you want to think about. Specifically, also as it relates to patients, when a patient walks into the practice, how will they be assigned to you? Will it be first up or mainly directed to the senior surgeon? So you can see there are a number of things at play here, but you definitely want to understand how you'll be busy at that practice. So in conclusion, at a high level, I'd say the big 5 things to consider in addition to compensation would be your protective covenants, your termination, you want to detail out your expectations in writing and understand how you'll be busy at that practice.
That's awesome. Thank you. And, Michael, in Gary's story, he mentioned when he was offered a chance to buy in and become an owner, they wouldn't share the books and records. Can you explain to our audience, is that normal? And what does that mean?
Yeah, and so here's a little context. So there's a couple of stages when you're an employed physician. The first stage, of course, is when you get that first contract, and in Gary's instance, the one that he could either sign or not sign. And in about half the time in those initial contracts, do they even talk about future partnership? Mm-hmm. And so what we always say is, at a minimum, you need to have some form of a conversation at that stage to understand what that looks like, just so you know if your goal is to be there for life, like in Gary's case, mm-hmm. that you have some understanding of what that even means. But you probably realistically are not going to get at that stage the financials. Then you get to the stage where Gary was, which is they're saying, okay, it's time. You're going to be an owner, and we're asking you to pay some amount to become an owner. And Gary's absolutely right. You should always be allowed to review the financials before you buy in. And frankly, if that's not allowed, it would be unwise to sign it, because you don't know what it is that you're buying if you don't have any of the underlying information.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And Bala, I want to come back to you. Often, when we're sitting here visiting with a potential person trying to contract, they tell us all these certain terms and conditions that are really important to them. Well, if those terms and conditions aren't in the contract, do they still exist?
Well, I feel bad being the bearer of bad news. Unfortunately, no. If it does not exist in writing in the agreement, and the reality is it just does not exist. It's like the 4 corners test that you may have heard of. If it's not within the 4 corners of your paper, it just does not exist. And if you come to think of it, no competent court can really enforce any term if it is not penned down in writing. So that being said, you definitely want to make sure that you detail out your expectations in writing, because unfortunately, not in writing, it's just not there.
That's so true. All right, Michael, what are some of your takeaways about when you should ask for help?
Well, I want to hit the pause button on our lawyer talk for a moment and understand that the bigger and more important reason that you have a contract is for the setting of expectations. So what Bala said is 100% true. If it's not in the contract, it's not. You don't have it. From a human relationship perspective, there is value to things that are outside of the contract, because what we're trying to protect against is unmet expectations. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about when should I ask for help, at the beginning, it's getting that guidance that, even for things that aren't in the contract, to know what to talk about so you can figure out where there is alignment and not alignment, both with you as a physician and your own goals and the practice and their goals, to see, if there are some bumps in the road down the line, and to figure out if this lines up with your risk tolerance. And so, kind of going back to the piñata talk, it's, really measuring things out before that blindfold goes on and you start swinging the bat, or in my case, really being a little more agile when I'm moving that piñata around with a 4-year-old.
Yes, you made the wrong connection. Well, Michael, that's a wrap on season 4 and our theme of when I should ask for help. To our loyal listeners who are used to seeing us every Wednesday pop up, we are going to take a break, and we will be back with you for the release of season 5 on July 7th, when we preview what we're going to talk about as our new thing for season 5 on the Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.